Welcome back. Environmental racism continues to be a pressing issue in our Bronx community. And recently, the think tank at the Thinkubator released a policy brief on the environmental racism issues right here in the borough, exploring the environmental inequities existing amongst the community. Joining us now to share a little bit more details is the Thinkubator's president and CEO, Dr. Edward Summers. And then we're also joined by the director of the think tank, Dr. Lessie Branch. And both of you, thanks for joining us. And I'll start off with Dr. Branch. And Dr. Branch, share with us a little bit about this, because when we talk about environmental injustice, we can definitely see, with the Bronx being number 62 on the health chart across the borough, that a lot of that comes really from environmental injustice.
So again, thank you for having us, Daren. It's a pleasure to be with you. And again, most of what we do, even in terms of the policy briefs that we publish, are driven by youth voices. And as you know, the Thinkubator is an organization that lifts up youth and gives them a platform to create the agenda, to work with organizations to help solve problems, and to even engage in the civic space. And so the brief really, again, is driven by issues that the Bronx youth at the Thinkubator want to highlight. So, you know, they put together a survey. Actually, Julian Joyner put together a survey, administered it, and I can't say we were surprised by the results. I mean, we have known for the last 40 some odd years, and possibly even longer than that, the intentional destruction, if you will, of Bronx infrastructure that results in a lot of the things that we are seeing today in terms of health outcomes. And, you know, to your point, the Bronx is number 62 out of all 62 counties in the state of New York when it comes to health outcomes.
Yeah. And so, Dr. Summers, share with us a little bit about the brief and what you were able to uncover.
Sure, thanks, Daren. And again, I echo the sentiment of my colleague, Dr. Branch. We appreciate being here. So with the brief, we surveyed, we have two data sets with this particular brief. We've surveyed New York City population, and then we have a much smaller data set of Bronxites of the data set that we looked at. And when we looked at knowledge about environmental pollution, environmental injustice, and racism, you know, most people didn't really know, and I think part of it is they didn't really understand the terms. But when we looked at the data a little closer, people knew that in the Bronx, particularly, that things like pollution, things like asthma, things like noise, things like having a large concentration of the diesel trucks in the Bronx, they knew those things, right? They knew that those things existed. So by default, they know about environmental racism, but may not know the terminology. And so what a lot of people said was that these things happen in the Bronx, right? You know, they acknowledged the high rates of asthma in the Bronx among young people. They acknowledged the noise. They acknowledged the air not being at the same quality as other communities. What the survey did was it actually looked at, all right, we know, we kind of knew this stuff already, but let's look at what should we be thinking about? How do we deal with these challenges that we have in the Bronx? For years, we already know that it's been documented that there's been environmental pollution. And as you both indicated, you know, we're at number 62 in terms of outcomes, the last borough, the last county in the state. So a lot of what the survey looked at was, what can we do and what should we be thinking about in terms of righting of wrongs of the environmental injustices that happen in the Bronx. So the think tank team and the young people, based on the recommendations of the people we surveyed, came up with four major recommendations. One being making sure that we incorporate youth as we think about the challenges that we have with environmental pollution and environmental racism. So how do we incorporate youth feedback in this process? Too often, it's the policy wonks out there making the decisions. So there's adults, and we don't include the young people in our decision-making process. So how do we get their feedback? How do we think about a youth-led, a youth-driven environmental justice policy framework in the Bronx? Two, it's looking at green jobs. How do we think about, as we move forward and as we support development in the Bronx, what are some of those green jobs? What are some of those development projects that the county supports, that the Bronx Borough President supports, that the city supports? And how do we make sure that these are green jobs, and how do we train and prepare people for these green jobs? Another aspect is, in looking at our planning in general, is to make sure that we are reimagining our planning and making sure that as we support buildings, that they're green led buildings, they're LEED certified buildings, right? So making sure that in our planning process that we think about a more just base planning process. And then I would say our last one is about green energy for low income housing, right? And NYCHA type of housing. How do we support, as we think about the assets that we have in our community, which is a plethora of low income NYCHA housing? How do we incorporate green energy technologies into those developments to make sure that we have a more environmentally friendly infrastructure in the Bronx? So those are some of the recommendations that came out of this brief. And I think it's always important to think about the first one I mentioned, which is how do we incorporate young people in the process? How do we get them in the process thinking creatively about some of these challenges that we have? Thinkubator has something amazing called the Thinkubator Solves program, where young people actually tackle issues that exist in the borough and exist for companies and exist in the public sector. And so this is just a great opportunity to really engage young people, get them thinking creatively, get them thinking without any walls, quite frankly, and to allow them to really go ham in terms of really just going and really thinking creatively about how to solve some of the challenges. So that's a major part of what we got out of it. We'd love to hear my colleague, Dr. Branch, as well.
Yeah, well, I want to talk to Dr. Branch about climate change, right? We talk about climate change, particularly with environmental injustice, environmental racism. What's the role of climate change in all of this?
So it's very we can implicate it for sure, right? And to the folks who still think that climate change is a hoax, look at what's happening in California, look at what's happening on the west coast of Canada. And so something that I looked at earlier this week, it was a phrase that Darren Walker from the president of Ford Foundation, he said, he pretty much talked about the whole situation that we are in, just in terms of inequity in general. It's like we're eating lobster on the Titanic, right? And so if we don't all get on board and speak with one mind and have unified action, we're all going to go down with the sinking ship. And so I think that's really a call to action, number one, whether you believe climate change is real or not. And so it's really apropos to failing to recognize the origins or even the underpinnings, if you will. And we're all going to end up under the sea if we don't do something about it, not necessarily because we're on a sinking ship, but because sea levels are rising, polar ice caps are melting. And then just from a political perspective, or just, think about what happens if the earth becomes inhabitable. Where do we go, right? Because there's no other planet that we can all just pack up and go to. And then just think about the implications of environmental racism for the Bronx. As it becomes more and more unsustainable, the climate, if we fail to act, we politically end up losing, if you will, representation, because if the borough becomes so inhabitable to the point that people move out, then we lose seats in Congress, and then that makes our uphill fight and battle to reverse some of these things that we're experiencing that much harder, because we don't have the representation that we need. And so that's sort of the frame that I'm bringing to it, and why the electeds that we presently have definitely need to make this a priority if they want to continue to have the privilege of leading the borough.
Yeah, Dr. Lessie Branch, Dr. Edward Summers, thank you so much for coming and sharing with me.
Thank you for having us.
No, thank you. Well, listen, now, if you want more information, please visit the website at thethinkubator.org, and then also follow them on their social media platform at the Thinkubator. We do have more Open coming up. We encourage you to stay with us. Don't go anywhere. Open returns right after this.